Gerhard Schröder is the Chancellor who sold Germany. Today he holds a title unique in the history of the Federal Republic, a national disgrace. With a chaotic trail of 5 marriages and a contract signed with Vladimir Putin immediately after leaving office, Schröder is the ultimate living proof of a dark reality. He shows us exactly how a Western statesman can trade his dignity, his legacy, and his country's honor for a stack of Russian petro-rubles. The path to his betrayal began in the mud of post-war Germany. Gerhard Schröder grew up in crushing poverty, the son of a war widow who scrubbed floors to feed the family. He was an outsider, mocked by classmates as Acker, a plow horse meant for hard labor. But this humiliation fueled a desperate, angry ambition. In a legendary incident in 1982, a drunk young Schröder stood outside the federal chancellery, violently shaking the iron gates and screaming, "I want to get in here! I want to get in here!" It was a declaration of war against the establishment. But when he finally won power, the champion of the working class fell in love with the lifestyle of the elite. He traded his rough edges for Brioni suits and Cohiba cigars. The press mocked him as the Kashmir Chancellor and the comrade of the bosses. He didn't want to save the poor. He wanted to stop being one of them. This lack of loyalty extended to his private life. Germans called him the Audi man, a reference to the car logo's 4 rings, because of his 4 marriages. He treated people like seasonal assets, discarding his wife Hilu, who had engineered his political rise, for a younger woman the moment he tasted success. Schröder was a man with a hollow core, craving validation and wealth. And far to the east, a former KGB officer was watching him, knowing exactly what currency he dealt in. While Schröder was shaking the gates of the chancellery in Bonn, a young KGB officer named Vladimir Putin was quietly working in Dresden, learning the art of the long game. Vladimir Putin is not a politician in the Western sense. He is a case officer. In the KGB, a case officer's primary skill is recruitment. It is the ability to read a target, identify their psychological voids, their insecurities, their vanities, their secret desires, and then fill them until the target is dependent. When Putin looked at Gerhard Schröder, he didn't just see a German chancellor. He saw a man with a massive chip on his shoulder. He saw the plow horse, who still felt inferior to the polished elites of Europe. He saw a man who desperately wanted to be seen as a titan of history. And Putin knew exactly how to play him. The seduction began the moment Putin ascended to the Russian presidency in 2000. At that time, Schröder was feeling isolated. His relationship with the United States was fracturing. He found George W. Bush intellectually incurious and arrogant. He found Tony Blair too slick, too subservient to America. Schröder, the man who grew up poor, has always had a visceral dislike for those he perceives as arrogant elites. He felt the West didn't give him the respect he deserved. Enter Vladimir Putin. Putin didn't come to Schröder speaking through a translator. He spoke to him in fluent, colloquial German, learned during his years in Dresden. This is a massive psychological advantage. Language is the key to the soul, and Putin could whisper directly into Schröder's ear without the filter of diplomacy. He presented himself not as the leader of a superpower, but as a Germanophile, a man who loved German culture, German beer, and German efficiency. He mirrored Schröder's personality. Schröder liked to be seen as a doer, a masculine, no-nonsense leader. Putin projected the image of the judo master, the tiger hunter, the man of action. The courtship was deliberate and theatrical. It was designed to make Schröder feel like he was part of an exclusive club of 2. The Männerfreundschaft, the male friendship, became the vehicle for statecraft. The bond was sealed during the Russian Christmas of 2001. While other Western leaders sent formal diplomatic cables, Putin invited Schröder to Moscow for a ritual designed for an audience of one. Outside Moscow, heavy snow fell over the forest. In the biting cold of 20 degrees below zero, Schröder and his family were bundled into a troika, a traditional Russian sleigh drawn by 3 horses. As bells rang in the frozen air, they glided through a winter wonderland ripped straight from the pages of a Tolstoy novel. Sitting next to him is not a stiff bureaucrat, but Vladimir Putin, pouring vodka, laughing, speaking German, treating Schröder not just as a partner, but as a brother. For a man like Schröder, who grew up with nothing, this opulence, this romanticized display of Slavic power and hospitality, was intoxicating. It appealed to the Kashmir Chancellor, the part of him that loved the finer things in life, but it also appealed to the Acker, the plow horse. Here was the Tsar of Russia treating the cleaning lady's son like royalty. The Americans never did this. The British never did this. Only Putin understood his worth. They moved from the sleighs to the banya, the Russian sauna. This is a critical detail in their psychological profile. In Russian culture, the banya is a place of total exposure. You strip down, you sweat together, you beat each other with birch branches to stimulate circulation. It is a raw, primal environment where hierarchies disappear. By inviting Schröder into the banya, Putin was breaking down the physical and psychological barriers between them. It is hard to maintain diplomatic distance with a man when you are both stripped down, sweating, and drinking beer in a wooden room. It creates a bond of conspiracy, a sense that it is us against the world. Schröder began to view the world through Putin's eyes. He started to believe that he had a special gift, a unique ability to tame the Russian bear that no other Western leader possessed. This is a classic trap of ego. He believed he was influencing Putin. In reality, the current was flowing the other way. The first public sign of this total capture came in 2004. It was a moment that made the German press gasp. During a television interview, a journalist asked Schröder a direct, simple question. Is Vladimir Putin a flawless Democrat? Any standard politician would have dodged. They would have said Russia is on a path or we have concerns. Not Schröder. He looked into the camera, his face serious, and answered, "Yes, I am convinced he is. A flawless Democrat." At this point, Putin had already destroyed the independent Russian media, NTV. He had already leveled the city of Grozny in Chechnya, killing thousands of civilians. He was already arresting oligarchs who opposed him. And yet, the Chancellor of Germany looked the world in the eye and vouched for his character. Critics laughed. They called it delusion. But it wasn't just delusion. It was loyalty. Schröder had ceased to be an objective observer of Russia. He had become a character witness for his friend. But if the saunas and the sleigh rides were the seduction, the blood debt was the shackles. There is a specific event that locked Gerhard Schröder into Putin's orbit forever, a detail often overlooked in the geopolitical analysis, but central to the human drama. It involves the most primal instinct of all, the desire for a family. By 2004, Schröder and his fourth wife, Doris Köpf, were desperate to adopt a child. For a German couple in their age bracket, adopting a child is a bureaucratic nightmare. The waiting lists are years long. The scrutiny is intense. International adoption, especially from Russia, is a minefield of corruption, legal hurdles, and red tape that usually takes normal people years to navigate, often ending in heartbreak. But Gerhard Schröder had a friend. The timeline is chilling in its efficiency. In the midst of the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, a crisis where Europe and Russia were ostensibly on opposing sides, Schröder traveled to St. Petersburg. While diplomats were arguing over the future of democracy in Eastern Europe, Putin was handing Schröder a gift that no money could buy. He opened the gates. The Russian bureaucracy, usually an immovable wall of ice, melted away instantly. The background checks, the waiting periods, the legal obstacles, they vanished. Putin personally facilitated the adoption of a 3-year-old Russian girl named Victoria, and it didn't stop there. A few years later, he did it again for a boy named Gregor. The psychological weight of this gesture was immense. Putin gave him more than a pipeline deal or a seat on a board. He gave him a family. He gave him his children. The debt of gratitude this created was immense. When Schröder looked at his daughter across the breakfast table, he saw the man who made it possible. When he tucked his son into bed, he owed that moment to the favor of the Russian president. This moved the relationship out of the realm of politics and into the realm of blood. It is a Godfather-style bond. You do not sanction the man who gave you your children. You do not betray the man who made your family whole. From that moment on, Schröder was compromised, not by blackmail tapes or dossier leverage, but by a profound personal entanglement. He had allowed the Russian state to enter his private life, to solve his most personal problems. This intertwining of the personal and the political became blatant at Schröder's 60th birthday party. He didn't celebrate it with a state dinner in Berlin. He celebrated it in Hanover, and the guest of honor was Putin. They brought a Cossack choir to sing. The images from that night show a level of intimacy that is almost uncomfortable to watch. Putin is there, smiling, hugging the family, looking like a benevolent uncle. Schröder was no longer just the Chancellor of Germany. He was a member of Putin's extended clan. While this romance was blooming, Schröder was actively reshaping German foreign policy to suit his new friend. He began to champion a concept called Sonderweg, a special path. He argued that Germany shouldn't just be a subordinate to America, it should be a bridge to Russia. He pushed the narrative that Russia was encircled by NATO. He echoed Putin's grievances about the West. When Eastern European countries, Poland, the Baltics, warned that Putin was dangerous, that he was an imperialist trying to rebuild the Soviet Union, Schröder dismissed them. He rolled his eyes. He called them paranoid. He even privately referred to them as troublemakers who didn't understand the big picture. He was so enamored with his special relationship that he became blind to the reality of the monster he was hugging. He believed he could tame the bear with friendship. He believed that trade, gas, and personal charisma could civilize Russia. Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. This was the slogan. The idea was that if we buy enough Russian gas, if we integrate our economies enough, Russia will become peaceful, democratic, and Western. It was a comforting lie, a lie that allowed German industry to get cheap energy and allowed Schröder to feel like a visionary statesman. But in reality, it wasn't change through trade. It was capture through greed. Schröder wasn't changing Russia. Russia was changing him. He was becoming more authoritarian in his demeanor. He was becoming more dismissive of the press. He was adopting the arrogance of the man he admired in the Kremlin. As 2005 approached, the trap was fully set. Putin had the German Chancellor emotionally, psychologically, and personally indebted to him. Schröder had alienated his Western allies. He had tied his reputation to the success of the Russian relationship. He was isolated, and in his isolation he clung even tighter to the one man who treated him like a king. The stage was set for the final act of the heist. The election was coming. Schröder's popularity was waning. He knew his time in power was running out, and lurking in the back of his mind was that old ghost, the ghost of poverty, the fear of becoming Acker again, the fear of losing the limousines, the respect, the lifestyle. He needed a lifeboat, and Vladimir Putin was waiting with a golden raft. While the early years define the tragedy of his character, the final days of his chancellorship unfolded like a crime thriller. It was a heist conducted without masks or guns, executed instead in the glare of television lights, signed with Mont Blanc pens, and sealed with champagne toasts. It is the story of how Gerhard Schröder liquidated the chancellorship of Germany and converted it into a private bank account. The sheer audacity of the betrayal revealed itself in the fevered autumn of 2005. The atmosphere in Berlin was toxic. The German economy was struggling. Unemployment was high. Schröder's bold reforms, Agenda 2010, were necessary for the country but suicidal for his career. The voters were angry. His party, the SPD, was in freefall. Sensing the end, Schröder did something desperate. He called for a snap election a year early. It was a gamble. He believed his personal charisma could save him one last time. He believed he was the Median Chancellor, the media chancellor, who could charm his way out of anything. But as the weeks ticked down to Election Day on September 18th, the polls showed a tight race. Angela Merkel, a dry, uncharismatic physicist from East Germany, was nipping at his heels. But while Schröder was fighting for his political life on the campaign trail, he was simultaneously securing his exit strategy. And this is where the timeline becomes damning. Mark the date, September 8th, 2005. This is just 10 days before the election. The polls are open. The nation is debating its future. Most leaders in this lame duck period would pause major strategic decisions. They would wait for the voters to speak, not Gerhard Schröder. On September 8th, in a hurried ceremony, Schröder's government signed the final agreement with Russia to build the Nord Stream pipeline. Look at the map. This project was controversial for years. It was designed to bypass Ukraine and Poland, pumping gas directly from Russia to Germany under the Baltic Sea. Eastern Europe called it a Molotov-Ribbentrop pact for pipelines, a weapon to isolate them. But Schröder rushed it through. He pushed the ink onto the paper just hours before he might lose the power to do so. Why the rush? Why not wait 2 weeks? The answer, as we would soon find out, was that he wasn't just signing a treaty for Germany. He was signing his own employment contract. Then came election night, September 18th, 2005. The results were a shock. It was a stalemate. Merkel's CDU won, but only by a razor-thin margin of 1%. It was a mess. That night, the leaders of all parties gathered for the Elefantenrunde, the Elephant Round, a televised debate that has become legendary in German history. The fatal arrogance, the hamartia of Gerhard Schröder, revealed itself in its purest form during the legendary televised debate known as the Elefantenrunde. Schröder appears unhinged. He is slumped in his chair. He is laughing inappropriately. His eyes are glazed, his speech slurred and aggressive. Many speculated he was drunk. His team claimed he was just pumped with adrenaline. But what he said was delusional. He looked at Angela Merkel, the woman who had technically just beaten him, and sneered. He mansplained to the nation that there was no way she would become chancellor. "Do you really believe," he roared, pointing his finger, "that my party would accept an offer from Mrs. Merkel to become chancellor? Leave the church in the village," a German idiom meaning get real. He was aggressive, macho, and completely detached from reality. He was a man who could not conceive of a world where he wasn't the alpha male. It was the public breakdown of a narcissist facing his own obsolescence. But reality, as it always does, eventually won. Over the next few weeks, the backroom deals were cut. Schröder had to go. The Social Democrats agreed to a grand coalition with Merkel, but the price was Schröder's head. He was forced to resign. November 22nd, 2005, the day of the transfer. It is a solemn ritual in a democracy. Gerhard Schröder walked out of the chancellery. He got into his car and was driven away. He was no longer Mr. Chancellor. He was just Gerhard. For a man addicted to power, this silence is terrifying. The phone stops ringing. The courtiers disappear. You are left alone with yourself. And for Schröder, that meant being left alone with his fear of irrelevance and his fear of not having enough money to maintain his lifestyle. Remember, the German Chancellor's pension is generous, but it doesn't buy you Russian oligarch luxury. It doesn't buy you the life he had tasted in the troikas and banyas with Putin. He needed a new income stream, and he didn't wait long to find it. In fact, he didn't wait at all. December 9th, 2005. The news broke on a Friday. It hit the news wires like a bomb. Gerhard Schröder was accepting the position of chairman of the shareholders committee of Nord Stream AG. The timeline was brutal. November 22nd to December 9th. 17 days. 17 days between leading the country that regulates the energy market and working for the foreign company dominating that market. 17 days between representing the German people and representing Gazprom. This wasn't a cooling off period. This was a barely cold period. The details of the job made it even worse. The consortium was 51% owned by Gazprom. His boss effectively was Vladimir Putin. The salary was a state secret, but leaks suggested it started at 250,000 euros a year, more than his salary as chancellor, for a job that required attending a few meetings a year. Later, as he took on more boards like Rosneft, his income from Russian sources would swell to millions. The reaction in Germany was visceral. The newspaper billed The Voice of the Common Man ran the headline, Gas Gerd. It stuck immediately. It stripped him of his dignity. He wasn't the statesman anymore. He was the gas man. Der Spiegel, the intellectual heavyweight, put him on the cover with headlines screaming about greed and lack of conscience. Even his own party members were nauseated. These were social democrats, people who believed in public service, in solidarity. And here was their former leader cashing in his chips before he had even unpacked his moving boxes. This was a heist not of gold bars, but of something far more precious, the integrity of the German state. By taking that job, he retroactively cast doubt on every decision he made in his final years of office. Did he push for Nord Stream because it was good for Germany? Or did he push for it because he was negotiating his own severance package? Did he oppose American policy because of moral principles? Or because he was aligning himself with his future paymasters? There is no smoking gun document claiming, if you sign this, I will hire you. But in the world of high-level corruption, the timeline is the evidence. In the world of high-level corruption, the implicit deal is always stronger than the written one. The revolving door is a known problem in politics. Politicians leave office and go into lobbying. It happens in America, in Britain, in France. But this was different. Usually a politician waits a year or two. Usually they go to a bank or a university or a friendly allied corporation. They don't go to work for a strategic rival. They don't go to work for a state-controlled entity of a country that is dismantling democracy. And they certainly don't do it 17 days after leaving office to manage a project they personally authorized. This was a total collapse of ethical boundaries. Imagine if the President of the United States left office and, 2 weeks later, took a job as the chairman of a Chinese state-owned surveillance company that he had just approved to operate in America. That is the scale of the betrayal. Schröder's defense was arrogant and dismissive. He told the press it was a private matter. He said, I am a private citizen now. I can do what I want. He acted as if his 7 years as chancellor were just a job he had quit, like flipping burgers. carrying no residual obligations of honor or secrecy. He claimed he was doing it for Germany's energy security. He framed himself as a patriot who was just keeping the lights on. But nobody bought it. The German public saw the transaction for what it was, a sale. The tragedy of those 17 days is that they destroyed a lifetime of work. Schröder had risen from the mud to the chancellery. He had overcome the lack of a father, the poverty, the sneering of the upper classes. He had earned his place in history. And then, for a salary from Gazprom, he threw it all into the trash. He traded his legacy for a bank transfer. But the heist wasn't just about money. It was about relevance. Schröder knew that out of office he would fade away. But with Putin, he was still a player. He was still in the room. He could still fly on private jets to St. Petersburg. He could still feel like a world leader, even if he was now just a glorified employee. Putin understood this need. He knew that for Schröder, the only thing worse than being corrupt was being irrelevant. So he gave him a golden cage, and Schröder walked right into it, locking the door behind him. The ink on the Nord Stream contract was the seal on his fate. The 17 days were the countdown to his moral death. And as the year 2005 ended, Gerhard Schröder was a rich man. He had his new wife, his new Russian friends, and his new millions. But he had lost something he could never buy back, his name. From that December onwards, he was no longer the Chancellor. He was Putin's man in Berlin, and the damage he would do in that new role was just beginning. Once Gerhard Schröder walked through the revolving door and settled into his office at Nord Stream, a strange silence fell over his conscience. The man who had once shaken the gates of the Chancellery demanding to be let in was now guarding the gates of the Kremlin, ensuring that no criticism got out. For the next decade, Schröder became the centerpiece of a massive geopolitical illusion. He became the high priest of a religion called Wandel durch Handel, change through trade. How did Germany sleepwalk into a dependency that would eventually cripple its foreign policy? The answer lies in this seductive slogan. It is rooted in the philosophy of the Enlightenment. The idea is simple. If we bind Russia to the West through economic ties, if we buy their gas and sell them our cars, they will inevitably become more like us. They will become peaceful. They will become democratic. A nation of shopkeepers, the theory goes, does not go to war. It was a seductive narrative. It allowed German industry to buy cheap Russian energy and feel virtuous about it. They weren't just making a profit, they were building peace. And Gerhard Schröder was the face of this doctrine. He traveled across Europe, attending galas, business forums, and talk shows, preaching the gospel of Russian partnership. He told the Germans that Russia was not a threat, but an opportunity. He told them that Vladimir Putin was a man they could do business with. But in reality, change through trade was a lie. It was a comfortable fiction designed to mask a much uglier truth. We were not changing Russia. Russia was funding its military with our money. Every euro that Germany sent to Gazprom for natural gas was a euro that could be diverted to modernize the Russian tank divisions that would later roll into Ukraine. Schröder wasn't building a bridge of peace. He was paving a highway for aggression, and he was charging a toll fee for himself along the way. During these years, Schröder lived the life of a Brioni socialist to the fullest. He became a fixture at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, often called the Russian Davos. These events were spectacles of oligarchic excess. Grand ballrooms dripped with gold leaf, tables were laden with caviar and vodka, and the air was thick with the scent of billions of euros in contracts. And there in the center of it all was the former Chancellor of Germany. He was the master of ceremonies. He was the icebreaker. His role was crucial. When German CEOs The heads of Siemens, Volkswagen, BASF came to Russia. They needed access. They needed the blessing of the Kremlin. Schröder was their key. He could pick up the phone and call Putin directly. He was the opener of doors. In return, the German business elite protected him. They shielded him from the criticism of the press. They argued that Schröder was a vital asset for the German economy. They ignored the moral rot because the dividends were too high. But while the champagne flowed in St. Petersburg, the mask of the peaceful Russia began to slip. And this is where Schröder's role shifts from greedy businessman to complicit apologist. The first major test came in August 2008, the Russo-Georgian War. Russian tanks rolled into Georgia, a small sovereign nation in the Caucasus. It was a dress rehearsal for Ukraine. It was a clear violation of international law. The West was shocked. But Gerhard Schröder? He went on the offensive, not against Russia, but against the victim. In a shameful display of loyalty to his paymasters, Schröder appeared on German television and blamed Georgia. He blamed the Georgian president, Mikhail Saakashvili, calling him a gambler who provoked Russia. He parroted the Kremlin's talking points almost word for word. He acted as the defense attorney for an invading army, a former leader of a NATO country, privy to the secrets of the Western alliance, publicly siding with the aggressor against a small nation pleading for help. It was a signal to Putin, "You can go further. I will cover for you." This became a pattern. Schröder developed a deep, visceral hostility towards anyone who dared to criticize his friend in Moscow. And his favorite targets were the nations of Eastern Europe: Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. These countries had lived under the Soviet boot for 50 years. They knew the Russian playbook. They warned loudly and desperately that the Nord Stream pipeline was a trap. They warned that Putin was an imperialist. Radek Sikorski, the Polish defense minister, famously compared the Nord Stream deal to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, an agreement made over the heads of the victims. Schröder's response was condescending and cruel. He dismissed the Eastern Europeans as paranoid. He treated their historical trauma as an annoyance. In his worldview, a worldview shared by Putin, politics was a game for great powers. Germany and Russia were great powers. Poland was just in the way. He referred to these nations as troublemakers who were getting in the way of the great German-Russian friendship. This is the hamartia of arrogance again. Schröder, the man who rose from poverty, had adopted the colonial mindset of an emperor. He believed he knew better than the people who actually lived on Russia's border. Throughout this period, Schröder wasn't just passive. He was active. He was lobbying. He was pressuring the German government, led by his successor Angela Merkel, to keep the gas flowing. And he succeeded. Despite the war in Georgia, despite the murder of journalists in Russia, despite the crackdown on dissidents, the German addiction to Russian gas deepened. The second pipeline, Nord Stream 2, began to be planned. Schröder was the architect of this dependency. He sold the rope that Putin would eventually use to strangle Europe's energy market. Was he a useful idiot? A man who was genuinely fooled? The evidence suggests something darker. Schröder is not a stupid man. He's a lawyer, a tactician, a man of sharp intelligence. He saw the brutality of the Putin regime. He saw the corruption. He simply didn't care, or rather he decided that the price was right. He had become a cynical operator. He accepted the Kremlin's worldview that might makes right. He admired Putin's strength because it mirrored his own desire for dominance. He looked at the weak, indecisive democracies of the West and felt contempt. He looked at the ruthless efficiency of the Kremlin and felt at home. The lobbying wasn't just about gas, it was about oil, too. As the years went on, Schröder joined the board of Rosneft, the Russian state oil giant. This was a company that had grown by seizing the assets of Putin's enemies, specifically Yukos. By joining Rosneft, Schröder was legitimizing state theft. He was putting his stamp of approval on the weaponization of the Russian legal system. The salary went up, the status went up. He was no longer just a German politician. He was a Russian oligarch in all but citizenship. But the most damaging part of his lobbying was the psychological disarmament of Germany. For a decade, Schröder and his network convinced the German public that there was no alternative to Russia. They created a mental map where Russia was the indispensable partner. They silenced the critics by calling them cold warriors. If you warned about Putin, you were accused of being stuck in the past. Schröder made it socially unacceptable in Berlin to be anti-Putin. He made appeasement fashionable. He made corruption look like diplomacy. There is a tragic irony here. Schröder's party, the SPD, has a proud history of Ostpolitik, the policy of opening up to the East to ease tensions during the Cold War. Willy Brandt, the legendary chancellor, knelt in Warsaw to ask for forgiveness for Nazi crimes. He built bridges to heal wounds. Gerhard Schröder took that legacy and twisted it. He didn't build bridges to heal. He built pipelines to profit. He didn't kneel to ask for forgiveness. He bowed to ask for a paycheck. He hollowed out the moral core of his own political movement and wore its skin as a disguise for his lobbying. By 2013, the illusion was total. Germany was hooked on cheap gas. The industrialists were happy. The politicians were complacent. And Gerhard Schröder was rich, respected in Moscow, and tolerated in Berlin. He thought the party would last forever. He thought the change through trade lie would hold up indefinitely. But history has a way of shattering illusions. The year 2014 was approaching. The Maidan revolution in Ukraine was about to erupt. The friendly Russia that Schröder had sold to the world was about to take off its mask and show its fangs. And when that happened, when the first shots were fired in Crimea, the world would turn to look at Gerhard Schröder and ask, "Whose side are you on?" And for the first time, the answer would be terrifyingly clear. Any lingering defense of Schröder as merely naive or business-minded evaporated in the third act of his tragedy. History drew a line in the sand in February 2014, the year the world changed and the mask fell off Vladimir Putin's Russia. It was the year the mask fell off Vladimir Putin's Russia. It began with the Maidan revolution in Kiev, a desperate cry for freedom by the Ukrainian people. Putin responded not with diplomacy, but with war. The little green men, Russian special forces without insignias, seized the Crimean Peninsula. It was the first time since the days of Hitler and Stalin that a European power had forcibly redrawn the borders of the continent. Then came the Donbass. Russian tanks, Russian artillery, and Russian proxies flooded into eastern Ukraine. And then the horror of Flight MH17, a passenger jet carrying 298 civilians, families, children, vacationers, blown out of the sky by a Russian book missile. The illusion of the peaceful partner was dead. The West woke up. Angela Merkel, Schröder's successor, was working sleepless nights, frantically trying to unite Europe to impose sanctions and stop the bloodshed. The atmosphere in Berlin was grim. The German government realized with horror that their energy dependence on Russia was now a geopolitical trap. This was the moment. This was the historic off-ramp for Gerhard Schröder. Any normal politician, any man with a shred of instinct for self-preservation or national dignity would have stepped back. He would have resigned from the Nord Stream board. He would have issued a statement saying, "I supported partnership, but I cannot support invasion. He could have saved his reputation. Instead, Gerhard Schröder did the unthinkable. Schröder refused to stay silent or hide. He decided to throw a party. On April the 28th, 2014, barely 2 months after the annexation of Crimea, Schröder stepped out of his limousine in St. Petersburg into a moment that would define his moral collapse. Vladimir Putin was there to greet him. Schröder's face lit up. He opened his arms wide, grabbing the Russian dictator in a massive, hearty bear hug. He is beaming. He looks like a man reunited with a long-lost brother. Behind them, the German press and the Russian security detail watch. That photograph hit Germany like a bomb. The headline in Bild screamed, Der Händedruck der Schande, the handshake of shame. The liberal paper Süddeutsche Zeitung asked if Schröder had lost his mind. Here was the former leader of the free world celebrating his birthday with the man the free world was trying to isolate. While German diplomats were counting the bodies in Donetsk, their former boss was counting the hors d'oeuvres in St. Petersburg. But it wasn't just a party, it was a statement. Schröder was sending a deliberate signal. By hugging Putin, he was effectively saying to Angela Merkel, to Washington, and to the German people, I don't care. He was saying, my relationship with this man is more important than international law. My loyalty to my friend is stronger than my loyalty to the Western Alliance. It was a moment of supreme arrogance. It was the Audi man putting his personal network above the state. He believed that he, Gerhard Schröder, stood above the petty squabbles of sanctions and borders. He believed he was untouchable. Schröder's defense of this night was even more insulting than the event itself. When confronted by angry German reporters, he didn't apologize. He scowled. He said, I will not let my friendship be dictated by others. He framed it as a matter of personal loyalty, as if international politics were a schoolyard dispute. He refused to acknowledge that when you are a former chancellor, you don't have a private life. Your friendship is a political asset, and by lending it to a warmonger, you are laundering his reputation. From that night on, Schröder changed. He became harder. He developed a trait that Germans call Starrsinn, a stubbornness that borders on obsession. The more the world criticized him, the more he dug in. He became the stubborn pariah. Between 2014 and 2017, as the war in Ukraine ground on into a frozen conflict, Schröder transformed from a lobbyist into a full-blown propagandist. He became a regular fixture on Russian state media. To the Russian domestic audience, he was a gift from heaven. Every time the Kremlin wanted to tell its people, see, the West is divided, the smart Europeans agree with us, they would roll out a clip of Gerhard Schröder. He blamed the European Union for the war. He famously said that the EU helped cause the conflict by trying to pull Ukraine into an association agreement. He called the sanctions senseless. He parroted the Kremlin's talking points with such precision that one had to wonder if he was reading from a script provided by his handlers. But the descent wasn't over. In September 2017, Schröder made a career move that crossed the final red line of legality and ethics. He accepted the nomination to become the chairman of the board of directors of Rosneft. Rosneft was very different from Nord Stream. Nord Stream, at least on paper, was an infrastructure project involving Western companies. Rosneft is the dark heart of the Russian state economy. It is the massive state oil company that acts as the piggy bank for the Kremlin's ambitions. It supplies the fuel for the Russian military. It funds the black ops budgets. More importantly, Rosneft was a sanctioned entity. After the invasion of Crimea, the West had specifically targeted Rosneft. European companies were forbidden from doing certain types of business with it. And who runs Rosneft? Igor Sechin. In Russia, Sechin is known as Darth Vader. He is not a businessman. He is a silovik, a man of force. He is a former KGB agent, Putin's right-hand man, and one of the most feared individuals in Russia. By taking the job as chairman of Rosneft, Gerhard Schröder was no longer just keeping the gas flowing. He was now directly working for a sanctioned arm of the Russian state, shoulder to shoulder with men the West considered international criminals. The salary was reported to be $600,000 a year. Why did he do it? He was already a multimillionaire. He had his Nord Stream money. He had his chancellor's pension. He lived in a mansion. He didn't need the cash to buy bread. He did it for the status. In the world of the Siloviki, in the boardrooms of Moscow, Schröder was treated like a king. He was the only Westerner in the room. He sat at the head of the table. He was a player in the great game. Back in Germany, he was becoming a joke. But in Russia, he was a titan. And for a man with Schröder's deep-seated insecurity, that reverence was a drug he couldn't quit. But if the Rosneft appointment was a political betrayal, the events of 2020 revealed a moral rot that was truly stomach-churning. This is the story of the Navalny poisoning. Alexei Navalny was the mirror image of everything Schröder had become. Navalny was brave where Schröder was cowardly. He was a corruption fighter where Schröder was an enabler. He was a patriot who risked his life for Russia, while Schröder sold his influence for rubles. In August 2020, Putin's agent slipped Novichok, a banned military-grade nerve agent, into Navalny's underwear. He collapsed on a flight over Siberia, screaming in agony as his nervous system shut down. It was an assassination attempt, plain and simple. Navalny was airlifted to Berlin. Germany, Schröder's country, saved his life. He was treated at the Charité hospital under the protection of German police. The German military laboratory confirmed, without a shadow of a doubt, that it was Novichok. Angela Merkel gave a furious speech demanding answers from the Kremlin. The entire German political spectrum stood united in horror, except for one man. When the press asked Gerhard Schröder about the poisoning, he didn't express sympathy. He didn't condemn the attack. Instead, he cast doubt on the facts. In a podcast, he suggested that there were no hard facts proving the Kremlin was involved. He muddied the waters, using the exact same tactic of plausible deniability that Russian intelligence uses. He suggested it could have been rogue elements. But then he went further. He attacked the victim. He criticized Navalny for his anti-Russian rhetoric. He implied that Navalny was a troublemaker who was damaging the precious relationship between Germany and Russia. The reaction from Navalny was swift. From his recovery bed in Berlin, fighting to relearn how to walk and talk, Navalny gave an interview to the German newspaper Bild. He didn't hold back. He said, "Gerhard Schröder is the errand boy of Putin. He protects murderers." Navalny went on to say that Schröder receives covert payments from Putin. "I don't have the document," Navalny said, "but I have no doubt." And what did Schröder do? Did he stay silent out of respect for a man who almost died? No. Gerhard Schröder threatened to sue Alexei Navalny. Let that sink in. A former chancellor of Germany threatened to drag a poisoning victim, a man who had just survived a chemical weapon attack, into court for defamation, all to protect the reputation of the dictator who ordered the hit. This was the moment the last of Schröder's friends in Germany turned their backs. This wasn't politics anymore. This was cruelty. It was the action of a bully. It showed that Schröder had completely lost his moral compass. He had spent so much time in the toxic bubble of the Kremlin that he could no longer distinguish between victim and perpetrator. He saw Navalny not as a human being, but as a threat to his business model. By 2021, the isolation of Gerhard Schröder was almost total. He sat in his office in Hanover, surrounded by portraits of himself and gifts from Moscow. His party, the SPD, stopped inviting him to events. Current political leaders refused to be seen with him. He was becoming a ghost. But he remained defiant. In interviews, he would lean back, light a cigar, and insist that history would vindicate him. "I don't do foreign policy," he would snap at journalists, his face red with irritation. "I do business. It is a private matter." A private matter. This was the lie he told himself every night to keep the demons at bay. He tried to compartmentalize his life. Here is Gerhard the businessman, and there is Vladimir the politician. But deep down, he knew it was a lie. He knew that Rosneft wasn't selling cookies. It was selling the oil that fueled the tanks. He knew that Nord Stream wasn't just a pipe. It was a noose around Ukraine's neck. He knew that he was being paid not for his business acumen, but for his silence. He was a high-priced trophy on Putin's shelf, a symbol to the world that Western democracy could be bought. As the year 2021 drew to a close, the clouds were gathering again. The intelligence reports were coming in. Satellites showed massive Russian troop buildups on the borders of Ukraine. The CIA was warning that an invasion was imminent. Schröder dismissed it all. Saber-rattling, he called it. Ukraine is the problem, he insisted. He was so deep in the lie that he couldn't see the tank tracks coming. He was a man standing on the deck of the Titanic, drinking champagne with the captain, insisting that the iceberg was just a figment of the imagination. But the iceberg was real, and the collision was coming on February 24th, 2022. And when it hit, it would not just destroy a country. It would finally, irrevocably, drown the legacy of Gerhard Schröder. On February 24th, 2022, the world woke up to the sound of air raid sirens in Kyiv. Russian tanks smashed across the border. Helicopters swarmed the sky over Hostomel Airport. The mask was finally brutally ripped off. It wasn't a special operation. It was a war of annihilation. It was an attempt to erase a sovereign nation from the map of Europe. In Berlin, the shock was physical. The policy of Wandel durch Handel, the belief that gas pipelines would bring peace, didn't just fail. It exploded. Chancellor Olaf Scholz, a social democrat from Schröder's own party, stood before the Bundestag and announced a Zeitenwende, a historic turning point. Germany would rearm. Germany would send weapons to Ukraine. The era of appeasement was over. In this moment of national reckoning, all eyes turned to one man, Gerhard Schröder. This was his final exit ramp. The door was closing, but it wasn't locked yet. The world waited. Would he finally resign? Would he finally say, "Enough? I cannot work for a man who bombs children"? If he had resigned on that first day, he might have saved a shred of his dignity. He might have been remembered as a man who was fooled, but who ultimately had a conscience. He did not resign. Day 1 passed. Silence. Day 2 passed. Silence. As the bombs fell on Kharkiv and Mariupol, Gerhard Schröder remained the chairman of the board of Rosneft. He remained on the shareholders' committee of Nord Stream. He issued a tepid statement on LinkedIn of all places, where he admitted there were mistakes on both sides. Both sides. He equated the invader with the invaded. He refused to say the word Putin. The reaction was a revolt. But this time, the revolt didn't come from the newspapers. It came from inside his own house. On March 1st, 2022, something unprecedented happened in the history of German politics. Gerhard Schröder's entire parliamentary office staff resigned en masse. Albrecht Funk, his chief of staff and loyal speechwriter for 20 years, a man who had stood by him through every scandal, every divorce, every controversy, walked into the office, put his key on the desk, and walked out. The secretaries followed. The driver followed. Schröder was left literally alone in his office in Berlin. The people who knew him best, who loved him most, could no longer look him in the eye. It was the ultimate personal verdict. When your own Praetorian Guard deserts you, the kingdom is already lost. But Schröder, driven by that fatal star sin, that obsessive stubbornness, decided he could fix it. He believed he still had the magic touch. In mid-March, a bizarre spectacle unfolded on Instagram. Schröder's fifth wife, Soyeon Kim, posted a photo of herself in a hotel room in Moscow, hands clasped in prayer, with St. Basil's Cathedral in the background. The caption was cryptic, praying for peace. It turned out that Schröder had flown to Moscow on a private peace mission. He hadn't coordinated with the German government. He hadn't coordinated with Ukraine. He just got on a plane, believing that he, Gerhard Schröder, could talk sense into his friend Vladimir. It was a tragicomedy of delusion. He sat at the famous long table in the Kremlin, the comical 6-meter-long white table where Putin keeps his distance. The image was pathetic. The former Chancellor of Germany treated like a petitioner, sitting yards away from the dictator. The meeting achieved nothing. Zero. Putin didn't listen to him. Why would he? Schröder wasn't a powerful statesman anymore. He was an employee. You don't negotiate with your employees. You give them instructions. Schröder flew home empty-handed. He had tried to play the hero, but he only proved that he was a pawn. Then came the final nail in the coffin. The interview. In April 2022, as the world was reeling from the images of the Bucha massacre, bodies of civilians bound and shot in the streets, mass graves discovered behind churches, Schröder invited a team from the New York Times to his home in Hanover. The scene the reporter described was surreal. Schröder was drinking white wine. He was laughing. He was boasting about his wealth. When asked about the atrocities in Bucha, Schröder waved his hand dismissively. "I don't think he ordered it," he said of Putin. "I didn't see any orders." He blamed lower-level commanders. Here was a former Western leader sitting in his luxury villa, sipping wine, and providing cover for war crimes. It was a moment of moral suicide. The German state had seen enough. In May 2022, the Bundestag, the German parliament, took historic action. By law, former chancellors are entitled to an office and staff for life paid for by the taxpayer. It is a sign of respect for the office. The parliament voted to strip Schröder of his office. They cut his funding. They closed his bureau. The reasoning was damning. He no longer upholds the ongoing obligations of his office. It was a formal declaration by the state he once led. You are no longer one of us. The humiliations cascaded like a landslide. The city of Hanover, which had been so proud of him, initiated proceedings to strip him of his honorary citizenship. He resigned before they could fire him, a final act of petty defiance. Borussia Dortmund, the football club he loved, revoked his honorary membership. The Social Democratic Party, SPD, his political family for 60 years, began legal proceedings to expel him. While they ultimately couldn't legally kick him out due to technicalities, in party law, the message was clear: you are unwanted. Lars Klingbeil, the chairman of the SPD, said publicly, Gerhard Schröder has no place in our history anymore. By the summer of 2022, the collapse was total. In September, the Nord Stream pipelines, his life's work, the steel cords that bound him to Russia, were blown up at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. Massive bubbles of methane rose to the surface. It was the perfect metaphor for his legacy. A multi-billion-euro project, built on lies and greed, destroyed in an act of violence, leaving nothing but toxic gas bubbling in the water. Today, Gerhard Schröder lives in Hanover like a ghost. He is a wealthy man, yes. He still has his Russian millions, but he is a pariah. When he walks into a restaurant, people stop talking. Former friends cross the street to avoid him. He is the man who bet everything on the wrong horse, and when the horse turned into a monster, he refused to let go of the reins. He is the only chancellor in German history who will not have streets named after him, but warnings written about him. The story of Gerhard Schröder is not just a political scandal. It is a human tragedy in the classical sense. It is the story of a man who conquered every obstacle life threw at him, only to be defeated by his own character. His hamartia, that fatal flaw, was a deep, unquenchable hunger. The boy who grew up in poverty, the acker who was looked down upon by the elite, spent his life trying to fill a hole inside himself. He wanted the suits. He wanted the cigars. He wanted the respect. He thought that money was the ultimate scorecard of success. He thought that friendship with a powerful czar was the ultimate proof of his worth. In his pursuit of the good life, he sacrificed the good. He ignored the truth that a statesman's measure is not the volume of gas flowing through a pipeline, but the integrity of his words. Gerhard Schröder wanted to be remembered as a great man of history. He wanted to be the peace chancellor who bridged East and West. Instead, he will be remembered as the pipeline chancellor. He will be remembered as the man who sold the keys to Europe's energy security to a dictator for a consulting fee. He will be remembered for the hug in St. Petersburg while the bodies piled up in Donbass. He will be remembered for the white wine in Hanover while the graves were dug in Bucha. There is a final crushing irony to his life. Gerhard Schröder spent his career trying to escape the poverty of his childhood. He succeeded. He died a rich man. But in the end, he fell into a different kind of poverty, a moral poverty, a spiritual bankruptcy so profound that no amount of Gazprom dividends can bail him out.